we're actually going to head back to Steve once more. He had the chance to speak with Indiana Congressman Larry Bucshon, who sits on the Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee. Steve and Congressman Bucshon spoke about how to increase innovation and the rare disease space and making breakthrough treatments accessible to patients. Let's take a listen.
Congressman Bucshon, thank you so much for joining us again. I always enjoy our conversations. You get the health world, and I'm sort of a lay person on the outside. So if any of my questions are, not too informed, but today we're talking about something that's very important for many Americans, but
Yes.
but any rare disease, and we have a lot of people who suffer from rare diseases, but rare disease means it's someone who's suffering from something with less than 200,000 people in the United States. And we're talking about the health infrastructure around that. We're talking about pharmaceutical approaches to that. And I'd just be interested in your perspective on whether the way in which we're approaching health and the costs, the accessibility, and the innovation in this space is designed correctly from your perspective.
Yeah, well, let me just say this. First of all, thanks for having me on. And as you pointed out, roughly 1 in 10 people in America have rare disease. And, the Orphan Drug Act was created in 1983 to help develop drugs for people that have these rare diseases, because the business model for that is difficult for the pharmaceutical industry. And since then, about 7,000 different treatment options have been developed. But of course, it's an ongoing problem. And, my concern is in the current environment where pharmaceuticals are expensive, how do we proceed? How do we make sure that patients have access to all these drugs? And I do think that the federal government is going to have to continue to be engaged in that. The one thing I don't think the federal government should do is more broadly price fix pharmaceuticals across the board, even though I think we can all agree for the non-generic drugs, we need to get the cost down, and there are ways to do that.
So, that's a really interesting question, because you kind of look at this triangle of tensions, right? You've got innovation, and, I've told a lot of my friends in the pharmaceutical industry that they ought to market their failures as well as their successes, because a lot of people don't understand the risk dimension that's involved in pharmaceutical development. There's some flops out there that don't work, and so that's resources. On the other side, you have cost is a real factor in some of these, and so that's an issue, and that affects accessibility and coverage. But yes. I guess one of the things that's changed in my assessment is the out-of-pocket, the insurance industry. We always kind of look at prices from one corner, but price is covered by a lot of other players in the ecosystem. And I'm just wondering if you think that needs to be part of our discussion as well.
Well, it absolutely does. What has happened since the Affordable Care Act came into play, because of the insurance structure where everybody was put into the same pool, and we essentially eliminated health underwriting, because we had a group of people that were basically uninsurable, that we had to find a way to cover them. And there were ways to do that. I mean, as you probably know, I didn't think the Affordable Care Act was the best way. And what that has resulted in is insurance companies have increased their deductibles, and they've also decreased the number of things or the amount of money that they cover. And that includes pharmaceuticals, some pharmaceutical drugs. So what you've seen is, even though people knew that drugs were expensive, they didn't really have to pay for it out of pocket. Now more and more people do. There are ways that we can address that. We need to eliminate anti-competitive practices that are in the industry, and we need to simplify the supply chain that takes some of the middle people out of the mix. We have a whole plethora of middle people, pharmacy benefit managers, the plans themselves, the distributors, and others that will do perfectly fine if we create what I would call a competitive marketplace, so that there was more competition, that they would have to get their fees down. Particularly the pharmacy benefit managers are paid by what we call rebates, and that tends to result, in my view, in upward pressure on the list price for non-generic drugs. So there's a lot of things we can do. What won't work is having the federal government price fix, because that will result in a lot of pharmaceuticals just dropped off the marketplace. And that's not my opinion. The Congressional Budget Office said if we do these type of things, 10 or 15 new drugs won't be developed because over the next 10 years. And also some current drugs on the market might be dropped off because they just don't fit a good business model. So we got to be really careful here, but we do need to get prices down.
One of the things that really interests me about this particular topic, because I think that the answers are nuanced in some ways, that when you sort of look at the price of a drug, an orphan drug, I think there's a legitimate question at hand of how you price it, right? Because you're dealing with an innovation directed at a relatively small group of people, right? So our healthcare system and a partnership between government and NIH and private firms that are engaged in research and development are trying to develop a therapy and a response in that area. But you're never going to get the market scale of some of this. And so I'm interested in whether you know of any models that cannot undermine innovation and investment, at the same time be reasonable and affordable by the system, by however is paid, so that those two can coexist, both tracks, as opposed to kind of creating a price structure that destroys the innovation sector, or an innovation expense that just seems to be priced too exorbitantly. So I'm just sort of interested in whether you see there are models we ought to be considering.
I mean, you've outlined the exact debate that I think the American people and Congress are having. How do we accomplish all of these things? How do we make sure that orphan drugs and drugs for rare diseases can get to the marketplace? And how do we not have them be so expensive that the people that need them can't afford them? And on the other hand, how do we make sure that whatever we do, we don't stymie further innovation by price fixing the drugs at a low cost, so there's no business model for them to be developed? That's the debate. I mean, honestly, I don't have a specific answer for you, because I think we have a ways to go. I think there are things we can do. And some of that in some of these drugs is just going to be that the federal government is going to have to be engaged in this as far as payment goes. And that's like the orphan drug situation, right? I mean, there's not a good business model for some of these. And in that way, I don't have an issue really with the federal government helping to support patients by covering some of these drugs in some way so the out-of-pocket cost is low. But I don't think there is a good model, that works specifically right now, that we can put your finger on one thing that will fix it. I know what I know what won't, and that is the federal government just saying, well, I know you have this new innovative drug, but you can only charge this much, because they won't innovate and they won't develop pharmaceuticals. But on the other hand, we want to make sure patients have access to these things. And I think we're getting there. I think the orphan drug program that's been in place for 40 years, and also some other things we're talking about as far as how we cut out-of-pocket costs will accomplish those goals. But we've got a ways to go, honestly.
I think that's really interesting. And a lot of my conservative friends, I remember when I worked in the Senate for a conservative Democratic senator, and I said we were talking a lot about Adam Smith and the invisible hand, but talking about areas where the market just simply didn't work is a very responsible and reasonable place for the government to take action. And a lot of my conservative friends absolutely agree with that. So it's interesting to hear you talk about that. But this Orphan Drug Act in 1983, there are a couple of times where policy seemed to spur the innovative pool. I remember the Bayh-Dole Act changed the way universities and professors and scientists could participate in the property rights. And honestly, innovation in this country went through the roof. It just spurred a lot of activity. It was very successful in terms of finding ways to incentivize more activity and investment in there. The Orphan Drug Act in 1983 also created a lot of these incentive structures. But as you said, it's 40 years ago. Do you have any thoughts, or do the Doctors Caucus, of which you're a member, have you thought about things that we ought to be considering to say, let's take another look at that. Let's take another look at this point. Or do we have our incentives in the right place? Are we doing as much as we should do to continue to spur innovation to deal with orphan drugs and rare diseases?
Well, we've done a lot. I mean, one of the things is we've dramatically increased NIH funding and National Cancer Institute funding over the last 10 years, really, and even prior to that, so that there's grants out there available to researchers, at least in the academic space. And honestly, the private sector, the drug companies themselves are putting literally billions of dollars into innovative research and development. So I think we're doing quite a bit. I do think, though, that the main issue here is the supply chain and how we get the product from development, manufacturing to the patient, and why there's so much upward pressure on pricing in between. And I think part of that is there's not as much competition in the marketplace as there should be. And, you know, one of the things we did in Energy and Commerce, we passed legislation that didn't make it across the House floor that would prevent large pharmaceutical companies from paying generic companies not to put a generic on the market that would compete with their drug. Believe it or not, in some cases that was happening. So I think we're doing quite a bit. We've increased the government funding availability for the academic setting and honestly also the private sector. But what we don't want to do is go backwards by then on the back end of this price fix the products at the end, because what will happen is they just won't be developed. There won't be a good business model. But I wish I had something I could put my finger on, but it's such a complicated space to work in, and it's very dynamic that, you know, what we want to do is mostly stay out of the way and let the private sector innovate and not have policies that stop that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm getting from you and I'm feeling the vibe is there's a bit of fragility in this research world and reaching these people who are in many cases desperate for support. Then you got to deal with the cost side. And as you said, it's designed to not ever reach full market scale, right? So that, you know, you've got tensions in there to keep it going. So it's really, really interesting. And I just get this sense of fragility, like do no harm, number one. And then you look at, okay, how do we deal with the cost? How do we keep the innovation sector going? But I mean, I can say these things because I'm on the opinion side of what we do. But let me ask you another question just about COVID and where we're at.
Yes.
There's some criticism beginning to emerge here and there that perhaps the Biden administration made a mistake in pulling the plug on Operation Warp Speed too quickly, that we jumped ahead, that there were still elements of the worst pandemic that we have had in a century. And it is, you know, a real issue out there. But when it comes to science and looking at how we continue to make sure that we got vaccines in a miraculous period of time, but guess what? You know, the virus does not sit still and innovates, and that maybe we shouldn't have done that, or maybe we need to reconsider. I'd just be interested to get your take, because this hasn't really kind of hit the media full force, but I've heard some criticism even as recently as last night that we should not have pulled the plug on Operation Warp Speed.
Well, I think that's probably true. And, you know, I just want to say, you know, during the Trump administration, Operation Warp Speed resulted in really probably one of the biggest successes in the history of medicine. But in fairness, I think, you know, once the Biden administration came in, we did get the vaccines out to people and get them distributed out to people. The thing that I think we're not really focusing on as much as we should continue to is therapeutics, because, you know, the virus is ubiquitous in our society. I mean, if you're vaccinated, you have much less chance of getting the virus, and if you do, you don't get severe illness for the most part. But what if you do get severe illness? And, you know, we need to focus, I think, some of the government type warp speed type of protocols into helping the pharmaceutical industry develop more therapeutics for the COVID virus, because this is going to be here probably forever in the world. And what we have to do is adjust to it, have vaccines. But I would agree, don't stop this innovative process where the federal government helps the private sector in a public-private partnership develop not only future vaccines potentially, but also therapeutics as it relates to COVID. So I would agree we need to continue to do that.
Well, I just want to thank, I would say, Dr. Larry Bucshon, Congressman Larry Bucshon from Indiana, member of the Health Subcommittee, and I really enjoy every time we have a conversation like this. I learn a lot. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I very much appreciate it.
Great discussion. Thanks again to Congressman Bucshon. And that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to Alexion for its support, and also to my colleagues Julia Manchester and Steve Clemons for joining me for these great conversations. And finally, thanks to all of you attendees for joining us for this discussion. For those who missed any of these conversations, we will have a video up from the event on our website shortly. I'm Bob Cusack. Have a great rest of your day and a nice weekend.